35. It was good to be back. Back to honest threats that could be carried out in the blink of an eye, back to wearing his blades in their proper sheaths. Back to being constantly alert and keeping his head down. Back to treating everyone as a potential enemy. Back to the life he knew. Rodin had a new room, not perfect but serviceable, and just on the edges of Jenna's district. He'd eaten at Jimny's, let it be known that he was available for the right job, listened to the rumors and gossip. He'd exercised and he'd tired himself out each day so that he slept soundly. Good to be back then. But not perfect. There was still the matter of payment for the contract on Leopold. Rodin sat behind a desk, ready for a meeting. The office was one of Jenna's, she could hardly refuse his request, not after what he'd provided her with. So she'd offered him the use of a small room, far away from her own office. The window looked out on one of the neighboring towers, and Rodin was thankful it didn't overlook the dome. If he never saw that monstrosity again, it would be too soon. He ran through breathing exercises until the door opened and Kat appeared. He looked just as he had when he'd entered Jenna's office, same over-smart attire, long coat hanging open, that ridiculous hat perched on his head. The expression on his face was one of wary interest, but Rodin saw the coldness behind it and knew he could still not trust this man. Rodin nodded and waved at the chair across from his own. The one with the torn fabric and the creaking backrest. Kat sat and placed his hat on the table. Then he eased back, somehow. The chair didn't creak as much as Rodin expected.
One of Jenna's rooms. She must think highly of you.
She hates my guts.
True. But she still thinks highly of you.
Rodin shrugged. For the moment. Things change all the time.
Very true. So you called?
Twice.
Twice. But we don't have anything to talk about, do we?
Rodin nodded. Payment.
Ah. Payment for the Leopold contract, correct?
Rodin nodded again. Kat opened his hands.
Payment arrives when the contract is completed.
It is.
Then prove it. Show us evidence.
You require evidence?
Of course. Any fool can say they've fulfilled a contract. You're no fool, Mr. Rodin. Prove to us that Leopold is no more.
Rodin shook his head. I can't do that. Kat took a long breath.
That is disappointing. Without evidence to the contrary, we have no choice but to assume that the target is still alive.
Rodin said nothing, simply raised one eyebrow and stared at Kat. He was almost enjoying himself. The air was still in the room, and Kat didn't move. He returned Rodin's stare, his face blank. Finally he spoke.
You didn't kill Leopold.
I fulfilled the contract. I followed the instructions to the letter.
And yet the counselor lives. The contract was for his death.
Rodin shook his head. He studied Kat, anticipating some kind of reaction, but the man simply tilted his head and raised his eyebrows a fraction. I listened very closely, Rodin said. The contract was for the removal of a target. That target was Councillor Leopold, and he has been removed.
A euphemism.
I agreed to remove Leopold, and as he is no longer in the dome, he has been removed. There was no direct mention of his well-being. Rodin rested one hand on the desk and the other dipped to his hip, just in case. But Kat made no sudden moves. He stroked his chin head to one side, his eyes never leaving Rodin's. Then he nodded slowly.
I believe you're correct. Those above me ensured I delivered the message exactly as they requested, so it's firm in my memory. Yes, they only requested removal.
So pay me.
They won't like that.
Not my problem. If they spent less time in the dome, they might learn to speak with more honesty. Kat's shoulders shook with a silent laugh, and his hand dipped into his jacket. Rodin eased a blade free, leaned forward in readiness. But when Kat's hand reappeared, it held a screen. He tapped.
There. Payment should go through within the hour. But tell me something. How did you persuade Jenna to provide assistance? You're not the only one in this room she dislikes.
Rodin considered for a moment. He would be breaking no confidences if he told Kat the basics. The man probably knew as much anyway. Jenna does a lot of her work through contacts, and she hinted at the advantages of having one within the dome. I was able to provide her the next best thing. He paused. Kat took the cue.
You gave her an exile from the dome. I assume he still has contacts inside.
Rodin nodded.
And I'm sure Jenna will want to learn all she can from him.
I'd imagine so.
How does our ex-counselor feel about this?
Rodin shrugged. How does he feel about not being killed? From what I know of the man, I'd imagine he sees this as a chance to learn.
And you? What do you have?
Payment.
Nothing more.
A leading question, but Rodin didn't care to follow. What else was there but the payment? In the silence, Rodin thought back to the room by the glass, when he gently lowered Leopold to the floor. Paskia, trembling, her face too pale, only believed the man still alive when Rodin grabbed her hand and placed her fingers over his neck, let her feel the blood pumping through his veins. Then he told her to go, practically pushing her out of the door, no longer listening to her mumbling. He locked the door, opened the panel in the back wall, and carried Leopold across the glass. The car Jenna had promised was waiting, and he was surprised to see her in the passenger seat. And now Leopold resided in one of her rooms. From what Rodin could gather, she was treating him well, and he had fast overcome his reluctance to talk. He was apparently in contact with Shay too, although Rodin had no idea how that was managed. He'd put together what happened in the dome too, a few uploaded security details on his screen, and he'd been able to hack their system from the districts. Stories circled about the disappearance of Councillor Leopold, although the official line seemed to be that he'd been granted permission to travel to Southsea Dome on a council-related matter. Rodin couldn't dig out anything on Shay, and he thought she'd probably gone to ground. Either that or she'd moved on. And there was no information on Perrin either. Such loose ends were frustrating, but Rodin had to accept that these things were out of his control. He did read an article on Sergio though. The artist spoke a great deal about his new work, but he also mentioned his new assistant, and how she'd been a major inspiration for the piece. He didn't dig any deeper. It was enough to know that Paskia was being looked after. At least the shock of what happened in that run-down building hadn't pushed her back into the arms of authority.
Of course you want payment,
Kat eventually said.
What else is there for a mercenary? So you might be pleased when you look at your account details. I've added a small bonus. A personal thank you, if you like.
Rodin knew his mouth was open, but he could think of nothing to say. Kat rose, picked his hat up from the table, brushed the brim.
We can serve many masters, Mr. Rodin, but ultimately we must look to our own interests. I always believed you were the only suitable candidate for this task, and so it proved. You fulfilled the contract, but in a manner aligned to my own agenda.
He placed the hat on his head, pulling it forward so that the shadow covered his eyes.
I hope our next encounter proves equally satisfying.
With a nod, the gentleman turned and left the room, pulling the door closed. Rodin sat, blade still in his hand. Slowly he sheathed it. He hadn't been totally honest with Kat. The payment wasn't everything. There was the challenge, the game. Rodin fought to win in the best possible way. He'd used authorities' words against them, and he'd fulfilled a contract without killing the target. This time he'd beaten the clients. At least he thought he had, until Kat's parting words. It felt like Kat was playing a different game, one whose rules Rodin didn't know. He had no idea if he'd won or lost. With a sigh he rose and left the room. He collected the rest of his tools from Jenna's guards, passing single words and sentence fragments in place of conversation, and then trotted down the stairs. Always time for more exercise. His room was an hour away by foot. He'd have preferred somewhere closer to the heart of Jenna's district, but he had to take what he could. It was a room, somewhere to rest. That was all he needed. That and his tools. Anything else was a burden. The air outside was cool and moist, and when he looked to the north the mist almost obscured the smooth arc of glass that rose above the district's buildings. For a moment, Rodin's feet turned that way, and he imagined what the weather would be like in the dome. Light rain maybe, just enough to keep the plants alive and take the dryness from the atmosphere. Then he thought of all those trapped under the glass and he smiled. It was good to be free. Thank you for your interest in this book. If you want to learn what's next in store for Rodin, the 9-book Dominion series continues with Dead Flesh. And for ongoing news from Ian, as well as a set of free, exclusive novellas, join the monthly mailing list. Details of this and other books can be found at twian.com.